So I was telling Christian right before I got up here, I kind of missed Randall today because he always says, preach the word with Christian. And he always is so attentive and pays attention, but he's on his way to Alaska, so keep him in your prayers. So we're on this series on suffering. I want to start with a story. So this past week, Monica had a procedure and they put her under anesthesia for it. So when she got out, she wasn't able to eat all the way until that point in time, of course. And when she got out, I picked her up. They wheel them out in a wheelchair and put them in the car, and we start driving off. She said, Kevin, I want to go immediately and get Starbucks. And I said, well, let's just get one at a coffee at the Starbucks by our house. She said, no, I want to go right now. And so she said, look, here I have my phone. I got one right here, see? And so I don't know if that anesthesia made her just bossier than normal or if she's just always a little bossy, but I tried to do it, she says. And so she said, make a U-turn right here. I got it on my phone. And so I made a U-turn, and she said, it's only about a half a mile away. And so I could tell from her phone I needed to turn real soon. I said, Monica, do I turn on this next one? But I don't know if the anesthesia kicked back in. She was just kind of zoning out. So I grabbed the phone from her to see where to go. She said, what are you doing grabbing my phone? You're so controlling. And so I looked at the phone, and sure enough, I made a right-hand turn from the left lane because it was coming right up on me. And then I turned right, looking at that phone. I pulled into a residential area and just stopped. She said, what are you doing? I told you I want Starbucks. I said, babe, this Starbucks is 1,000 miles away. So don't let anyone make decisions when they're under anesthesia. I tried to get her to sign some legal documents, but she refused. So she was at least that smart. Now, you know, suffering is something that if you're not careful, suffering will cause you to make bad decisions. Or suffering will cause you to approach life in a very negative way. Suffering can have a deeply harmful impact on your life if you don't have a foundation already established with God before it comes. And we talked 3 weeks ago when we introduced this series about how there aren't a lot of answers out there. If you're an atheist, you're in trouble, buddy. Because if you're suffering, guess what? That's all there is this life. And I think of people in other countries, they have no hope. They live in poverty. If this is the only life we have, is this life, there's no hope. So there is not a philosophy or a faith, and atheism is a faith because they can't prove there's no God. There's not a faith that is more discouraging and less helpful than atheism. And we also talked about the world religions, and we may mention them as we go today, and they don't offer hope either. Only Christianity, we talked about 3 weeks ago, has a worldview that makes sense of the suffering we see. And Christianity explains that it's because of sin that suffering entered into the world. It's a consequence of sin, of Adam and Eve's sin. It's a consequence of our own sin. And of course, we also know that it's a consequence of living in a world with sin. So in 1 Peter chapter 4, if you want to turn there, beginning in verse 12, it says this, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. So don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when suffering comes into your life. You live in a fallen world. It happens all around you all the time. It can be an accident. It could be cancer. It could be someone that you love lets you down and you can't control all these things. So as Christians, we should not be surprised when suffering comes upon us. Now, interestingly, he says in verse 15, but let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. So you're going to suffer. At least be smart enough not to suffer for doing stupid things, for being a murderer, a thief, for hating someone. Don't let your own sins bring additional suffering on you. But you are going to suffer. And it says in verse 16, yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. It's like these songs that we sing. If you glorify God through your suffering, you don't have to be ashamed of it, it says here. And actually, the Greek word there actually could be translated, you don't shrink from your suffering. As a Christian, you march into that suffering because you have an understanding of the world that's different than anyone else's. The world doesn't know how to deal with suffering. In fact, this book, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, it was really pushed at one time by Oprah Winfrey many years ago. And it's based, by the way, on on Buddhism, It's based on Buddhism. And I want to just read to you a couple of the points that this book makes about suffering and about life in general. Eckhart says, the present moment is the most precious thing there is. And he says, people don't realize that now is all there ever is. There is no past or future except as memory or anticipation in your mind. Listen to what he says. And this is Buddhism. The past gives you an identity, and the future holds the promise of salvation, of fulfillment in whatever form, but both are illusions. And that's what Buddhism believes. Both the past and the future are illusions. The only thing you have is right now. And that's the only thing that matters. And when you die, you cease to exist as an individual. You're just absorbed back in to the universal spirit of God. So why should you worry or worry about suffering? And he goes on to say, people tend to dwell more on negative things than on good things. So the mind then becomes obsessed with negative things, with judgments, guilt, and anxiety produced by thoughts about the future, and so on. And so their belief is suffering is a figment of your own imagination, and if you'll just control your mind, the suffering will go away. Well, tell that to somebody dying of cancer and see how well that goes. Tell that to someone who their spouse left them with their kids and see how well that goes. It's just not a philosophy that makes sense. Naturally, we do need to control our minds. But someone struggling with self-esteem, for example, you don't find it through making yourself more beautiful. You don't find it by making others like you better. You find it by getting closer to God. And so the Bible teaches that there's a reason for suffering. Buddhism teaches that it's an imagination of your mind. But the Bible teaches suffering is real, it's a consequence of sin, but that God repurposes suffering. I'll give you an example. Someone that's been through depression. There's nothing fun about going through depression. It sucks the life out of you. Sometimes you can't see yourself ever getting through, but for those who have, with the help of God, gotten through depression, they come out stronger. They come out with a way of looking at life that is more profound and has been enriched because of the suffering that they went through. Where those who have never experienced suffering or pain in their life, they think of themselves stronger than they really are. Because they haven't had to face a struggle that comes with suffering yet. So the Bible teaches that suffering has meaning. I don't like that. I don't like that I have to live in this world with suffering. And for those of you who haven't experienced it, thank God and help others. Thank God and help others. And get ready because it's likely to come in your life before you die. But the Bible teaches that suffering has a purpose, and one of those purposes is to refine you. Look in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 through 7. It says, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So basically saying, listen, these trials come to refine you. They burn away the impurities in your life. When suffering comes in your life, if you have an attitude problem, it's going to show up. If you're proud, that's going to show up. if you are overly attached to this world and to pleasure and relaxation and comfort, suffering is going to show that you are putting your hope in the wrong areas. It reveals who you really are, and it reveals what your weaknesses are. You know, there's a gospel out there, you've heard it, it's called the health and wealth gospel. I've listened to some of those preachers. Some of what they say is true, but I got tired of hearing this preacher over and over again say, well, you know what? If you get looked over at work, if someone's mistreating you at work, well, don't worry about it. Your promotion's on the way. God's just preparing you. It's about to come. Or if you keep getting rejected by people that you're looking to, because you're looking for a mate, and people keep telling you no, don't worry about it, because the one that's just right for you is coming. Or if you have a health problem and that health problem doesn't get any better, well, you just keep praying to God because you just can know that your healing's on its way. Well, you know, sometimes that's true. But often it's not. Often the person doesn't get well. Often people don't find who they're looking for. And often the promotion never comes and you get overlooked unfairly. And how do you deal with that? It doesn't always work out the way that we think it should, but God uses this suffering to somehow create his purposes in our life. Now, this is a book written by Elisabeth Elliot, and it's a fiction book, but it's written on her own experience in Africa. And this particular fiction book is about a Christian lady named Margaret who was trying to minister to Ecuadorian Indians. And when she was in Ecuador, she met this man named Pedro who actually knew their language and was helping her learn the language so she could translate the Bible into their language and teach them the gospel and convert them. And that was her life work. But one day Pedro got an infection in her leg and she gave him a penicillin shot. He had some sort of reaction to it and died. And while he was dying, she was praying to God, how can you do this? This is my life work. I won't even be able to reach these Indians if he dies. You cannot let him die. It's against your will. And he died anyhow. And so it's kind of discouraging, but there's not always a silver lining. Sometimes things happen that we don't want to happen. And she said, this was so huge in my life because I was so angry, but I realized this. That if God's job is just to help me accomplish what I think needs to happen in his kingdom, he betrayed me. But if God's God and he's in charge, he freed me. And he freed her from what? He freed her from her expectations of what God should have done. He freed her from her plans that she was trying to pull God into. God has it all under control. And unfortunately, it's not always a plan that fits with my plans or with my desires. And it's hard to do this, but if you believe in God, you just have to realize I'm not God and I'm going to let God be God. And that's not easy to do. There's a quote here by Joni Eareckson Tada, and we're going to show a video later about her. And we did 3 weeks ago. At 17, if you remember, she dove into a pool and she was paralyzed for life. And she says this about suffering. God permits what he hates to accomplish what he loves. Now, it's not that he does it, he permits it. And I think that if there wasn't suffering in this world, we wouldn't want God. I think if we lived forever, we wouldn't want God. We'd want to be selfish. But because we've chosen sin, because we live in a sinful world, to some degree, we can't live forever or we would be selfish. And God uses the suffering in our life, whether we like it or not. So it refines us, but it does something else to us. It also renews our spirit. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. So he says this, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So he starts out with, we do not lose heart. And really that word, kakeo in Greek, means don't faint. We don't faint. In Peter it said you don't shrink, and now he says, and you don't faint. But we march into it. But why? It says here, because even though our outer self is suffering, it's dying, it's wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. And it forces us to focus on the things that are unseen rather than the things that are seen. And when that happens, it renews your spirit. Now, I'm not a big fan of airplanes. I moved here and Don Moore offered to take me up in his airplane. I said, man, I love you, brother, but no. And I may change my mind someday. But when I go to Brazil, every time I get on these airplanes, I think about my kids and I think about my mom. I don't worry the whole way, but I think about all those things and I think, are you ready? Are you ready to go? Because it could happen today. And that's not even very severe suffering, but suffering can rob your spirit, or with Jesus, it can renew your spirit, it says here. Because it can cause you to focus on the things of God rather than the things of this earth that are all going to burn up anyhow. And Randy Alcorn, who wrote the book Heaven, we did a series on it a couple years ago. His wife, Nancy, had a 4-year battle with colon cancer before she died in her middle 50s. And in 2019, she wrote a letter to a friend that was suffering. And listen to part of what she wrote to her friend. The cancer battle has been tough. However, my time with the Ancient of Days, one of my favorite names for God, has been epic. He has met me in ways I never knew were possible. I've experienced his sovereignty and mercy and steadfast love in tangible ways. I now trust him at a level I never knew I could. And she goes on to say, my cancer is God's servant in my life, and he's using it in ways he has revealed to me, and in many more I have yet to understand. She was looking at what was unseen. She used her suffering as a way to connect in a deeper way to God, because eventually we're all going to suffer and go on. And she said that God revealed to her that he was using this to teach her and to show her truth. 9 months after she wrote this, at her request, the family came in and she was reading out of her journal to her grandchildren, and one of her grandsons just sat beside her, soaking all this in, and finally said, Grams, if you can trust God in this, I know I can trust him in whatever I'll go through too. And another grandson said, I'll never forget what you said today. When we let God live through our suffering, it impacts those around us and it renews our spirit within us. And if God doesn't use suffering, then anyone facing a terminal illness, anyone who has somehow lost a loved one, anyone who has experienced a great setback, anyone who has experienced unjust suffering in their life, what do they have to hope for? If God's not in charge and using this. And she writes, or maybe Randy writes, if the onlys and what ifs, the sufferings, can rule our lives and drive us crazy, instead, embracing God's higher purposes, even when invisible to us, in painful and tragic events, affirm God's greatness. That's what those songs were about. People that affirmed God's greatness in the middle of their sufferings because they knew that God was in control. It's not fatalism, but it's knowing that there's meaning to life anyhow. That there's something really important about life, even in the middle of suffering. C.S. Lewis writes that God whispers to us in prosperity, but he shouts to us in adversity. Suffering reminds us that this life isn't forever and there's something more important waiting for us. And how we face it says a lot about who we are and where our faith is, and whether or not we're letting God refine us, and whether or not we're letting our spirit be renewed in the image of Christ. And not only that, but it bonds us to Jesus. Look at Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 16. He says, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. So it says we're heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him. Sympasko is the word in Greek, suffering with. We have to suffer with Christ, and if we're willing to do that, provided we suffer with him, then he has something for us. We're heirs of God, children of God, with a hope for something better, a hope for the future. Now here's the thing. Jesus is not asking you to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. You may think this just seems unfair. Or you may, in the future, run into suffering and you feel like it's just not just. But Jesus went through it as well before you. He was willing to suffer to show you that life still has meaning and value even in the middle of suffering. He chose, think about this, he chose to redeem you through suffering. That's the way he redeems us and saves us. It's through his own suffering. 2 weeks ago, Christian talked about how we don't suffer alone. Christ is with us. He walks through it with us. He's with us to experience it with us and help us through, because he's been there before us. And through Christ, we can have the attitude and the spirit and the faith to know that this suffering still is going to bring meaning in my life. It doesn't take away the pain. And we're going to talk about some practical tools in the next few weeks for facing suffering. There's things we have to go through. There's things that we can do to rely better on God. There's some tools that we can use that the Bible gives us, but we need this theological foundation first to understand that there's a reason for suffering, and we don't understand it all, but it's God's world, and he's redeeming us through suffering. So, Joni Eareckson Tada, I'm going to show you a little video. And she had spent a lot of time looking at the reasons for suffering. And then it dawned on her all at once, here's the biggest reason for it. Listen to this.
I once wrote a book called A Step Further, and that was back in 1978, and it was my effort to, quote, make sense of suffering. God allows suffering to deepen your faith. God allows suffering to refine your character. An alphabetical list of 1, 2, 3, 4, the 16 good biblical reasons as to why God allows suffering. And I remember passing it under the nose of Elizabeth Elliot, the manuscript. I wanted her endorsement. And she said to me, I'll never forget it, "It's exact, Johnny, it's true, but it's very technical." I was crushed. But that was in 1978. And now, so many years later, I understand what she means. Because suffering and understanding it is not a matter of good biblical reasons as to what God is doing and why. I think the whole purpose behind it is to press us up against the Lord Jesus and not make suffering so much about us. Oh, how will my faith be refined? How will my prayer life be deepened? What will I now understand about God's purposes? No, it's all about how can I hear his heartbeat? How can I resonate and identify with him and his sufferings? So somewhere there was a bing, like a change, and I realized it's not about me. My paralysis is about knowing Jesus better And that, I think, is the summation of it all, just to know him better.
Wow. You know, when I'm flying on those planes, I'm just trying to get close to God, and I'm going to tell you that I've been through some suffering in my life. And when I did, I held on as tight as I could, because there was comfort nowhere else except in Jesus. And I knew he was refining me. And although it hurt for a while, I came out renewed. And I came out bonded really close to Jesus. And I'm grateful for that. And so, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. So don't forget the last part of it. We're headed to glory. Christ was already taken there through his suffering. He went to the right side of the Father, and glory was bestowed on him. And that's where I want to end up. This life is short. The younger you are, the harder it is to see that. The older you get, the more you know it. But trust me, it's short. But glory with Christ is forever. And so no matter what you go through, I want you to know this, that Jesus is right there with you. That Jesus can redeem you. That Jesus has a purpose for you, and that Jesus someday will bring you into his glory. And because of that, don't let the enemy get a foothold, because you have a foundation to stand on. And you can sing the praises of the one who promises to be there with you till the very end. If we can encourage you to root your life more deeply in Christ, maybe you're suffering, you just need us to come around and pray for you. We'd love to pray for you. Maybe you haven't rooted yourself in Christ yet, and it's not too late. If we can help you in any way, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.